Camp Hacker, bringing your world into focus.
Welcome to Camp Code, a podcast brought to you by Camp Hacker. This podcast is dedicated to what many camp professionals believe to be the most important time at camp, no matter what you call it, staff training, orientation, or leadership training. This critical time period prepares your staff to fulfill all the promises that you make to parents and customers throughout the rest of the year. I'd like to get started this morning with an introduction of our hosts. So let's start off with Beth.
Hi, I'm Beth Allison. I'm a co-owner of Camp Hacker. I'm a former camp director and executive director in Muskoka, Ontario, Canada, and I'm now a camp consultant with my husband Travis, and we're located in Woodstock, Ontario.
And Gab.
My name's Gabrielle Rail, and I'm one of the camp directors at Camp Boro. Camp Boro is an all-girls camp situated in the Laurentians, Quebec.
And I'm Ruby Compton. I'm the Summer Camp Program Director at Green River Preserve. We are a nature-based program located on 3,400 acres of private wildlife preserve in western North Carolina near Asheville. So this morning's topic is intelligent leadership training design. So we want to discuss today a little bit about how to set up your staff training and some of the scheduling. And Beth, will you share a little bit more about why we wanted to talk about this topic?
Absolutely. We chose this topic because we cannot stress enough the importance of well thought out, well planned, and exceptionally intentional leadership training. So it's imperative that we as camping professionals take the time now to think through every minute of every day of training and use each one of those minutes to our advantage. So whether it's making the most of a learning session or a time of community building or ensuring our staff is well rested and ready to go when the campers finally arrive. So as always, we want to be really intentional with everything we do, so we thought it was important to talk about this topic.
Fantastic. And I want to first go around and have each of us share about our staff training, just a little bit about length, maybe certain trainings that you cover or not, like do you do CPR certification, those sort of things, because staff trainings do vary greatly depending on where you are and, what kind of camp you are, that kind of stuff. So Gab, will you start off just giving us a brief overview of how much time you have for staff training and how that works for you guys?
Sure. So our staff are typically divided into three groups: leadership team, activity heads, and then the rest of our staff. Our activity heads and our resource staff all have cabin groups. But if you're not an activity head, then your staff training is 8 days. If you're an activity head, you have a 2.5-day training just before everybody else comes. And then our leadership team, their staff training is approximately 10 days.
Cool. How about you, Beth? What are some trainings that you've facilitated and been a part of?
So pretty much the same kind of setup as Gab. When we were directing, we had an 8-day training session for the entire staff team, but had prior trainings for other members. So leadership team members and so on came a few days early. Resource staff, we called them not activity heads, but just a different name for the same thing. So we had training prior to that. But we also believed in starting training right from hiring day. So we had hiring day rather than just interviews, where we would bring all the applicants together. We divided them into two groups. So we had a day in January for our senior staff, resource staff, and a day in February for counseling staff. So we started training with them because those were like 8-hour long days, maybe 6 or 7, but they were long days, including eating lunch together. And so we really started the training there. We also would host a weekend in April. In the beginning, we had one for counselors and one for resource staff, but near the end, Travis and I just ran out of weekends. So we used to do just the one in the city, so not at camp. And for us, because we were a Christian camp, we met at a church for a weekend, did all kinds of training and group building community things on the Saturday, slept overnight in the church, and led the church in worship the next morning together, and then had lunch together. And of course, we also had our staff orientation in May, which was a weekend where all of the staff would come up to camp for a weekend in May. And it's really where we focused on group building. There was some sort of training aspects to it, but it was really sort of community building, getting our feet under us, sort of setting the foundation, all that kind of stuff. And of course, we also did in-service at the end of July for 3 days where there were no campers there, and we did some retraining. And I know, Ruby, you've done that stuff too as well.
Cool. So at Green River, we actually are really lucky to have a luxurious staff training. We have about 2 weeks with our full staff.
Amazing.
And it's fantastic. And we this year are going to a system where, again, some of our naturalists, our activity coordinators are coming in a couple days early to get some additional training before the full staff arrives. But we have a lot of trails that we have to take the staff out on. We do a full staff camp out during our leadership training. We also do a full weekend where the staff are just out on hikes. So they eat breakfast, go out on a hike for 3 hours, come back, eat lunch, go out on another hike for 3 hours.
Wow.
So that takes up some time, but there are just trails and places the staff have to learn to lead the kids out there. So that's one of the reasons we have such a long staff training. And we also do CPR and first aid as part of our staff training. We do a hybrid course through the Red Cross. So they do a lot of the book learning ahead of time, and then they do a skills verification once they're at camp. And we don't offer many other trainings specific for camp, but there are several camps in our area and in our network that do. And so if staff are needing a lifeguard certification, or if they're needing a climbing certification, archery, whatever it might be, we'll send them to a couple other camps that really specialize that and kind of run that as another business throughout the month of May. The YMCA camp where I was previously, we did 1 week of staff training. When we opened up resident camp, we started doing overnight staff training, and that was a big difference. But, I did 3 years of we did staff training 8 to 5 for 5 days, and that was it. And it's kind of terrifying to me, but that's certainly the way that a lot of people do it. So it's, again, that was a very similar setup to what you guys have been talking about having that leadership team come in maybe early on, a few weeks out, then have your activity coordinators and some of that specialized training, and then having that full staff join in. So seen several different models. So having kind of given that overview and that framework, I want to, again, start big picture and talk about how does your staff training progress? So when you're looking at the big picture of training, how do you set it up? Are there things you tend to do at the beginning, things you tend to do at the end? Are there ways that you set up your schedule that are different during training versus the rest of the summer? Are there any special routines that you only have during training? So Beth, why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about how you look at the setting up orientation big picture wise?
Okay. After years of training and us always tweaking every year just to make things better, we found that 1 year things got really complicated. Like, it just became so complicated. So we decided from that point on to make it really simple but significant. That was sort of our goal. So we ran it as much as possible like summer camp because we wanted the staff to get used to that routine. And we ran everything the way we did during the summer. So we obviously added in special touches here and there, and I think that that's really important and a great opportunity to take advantage of that. But it was really key that that routine and the way things were done, meals, all those things, right from the get-go were set in place. We even placed staff members in cabins. So we mixed them up with returning and new staff, and we put our senior staff or our leadership team people in as their counselors for the week. They greeted them on opening day. They helped them move into cabins just like campers. They lined up for meals in those cabin groups and, sang as they were waiting to be let in. They ate with that cabin group once a day. The other 2 meals, we mixed them up with other staff. They had a cabin theme during the week. It was a time for those so-called counselors to do extra special things for their campers. Even one night they would put them to bed and sort of give those techniques. And it was a great way for those senior staff members to share that counseling advice and answer questions throughout the day. So we really sort of ran stuff like we ran summer. That was really important.
Cool. And I would add on to that, to have your leadership team be successful in those roles, it's really critical that you have everything prepared and ready to go.
Absolutely.
Prior to training, because I've been that leadership team member and we just weren't ready. And so we were really torn between needing to lead the cabin, but also needing to prepare for staff training the next day.
Yes, exactly.
And didn't do anyone any good. So making sure that you go into staff training with everything prepared, ready to pull off the shelf and go, because that can be such a fantastic resource for the staff. Cool. Gab, what about you?
Similar to Beth, I think having your staff training reflect what as closely as possible what your summer schedule looks like is very, very helpful. And as well as just showing them how you respect those times is going to help model for them to respect those times during the summer as well. Also, the simplification thing I think is key, and I think younger in the job directors tend to go into the complicated, and then you start to learn we need to simplify. So
yes.
I certainly did the same thing, and it's because you have so many great ideas and you want to implement them all. And but one of the things that we realized that was helpful for our staff members is that each day had a learning theme. So we're always camper focused. So everything that we talk about has to do with the camper and has to do with how to care for the camper. However, one day would be an activity day, and it would be really focused on how you run activities. What do we do when campers are late? Just very, very focused on that. Another day would be on programs. Another day would be on safety and, so on and so forth. And so each day sort of had a theme, and we incorporated sort of camper behavior management within those themes. But that really helped the staff understand what they were learning that day and what that focus was. And that really helped us organize our information. And some of the days were half-themed days because there's just a little bit less information, but that's been very helpful for us, and I think our staff really benefited from it.
Cool. And we had actually a specific question on the Summer Camp Pros Facebook page from Mark Perlman, who asked this question, that research shows that teens do better when waking up later. So should we shift our schedule during staff training? Normally we would do flag raising at 8 when our kids are there. So do we do the same during staff training, but start it at 9 instead, to work more in line with that biology? Do either of you all have thoughts on that?
Yeah, we tried both. So we've done both. The one year that we tried having we had a 2-hour delay because we had read up on all of that sort of thing. So breakfast was at 10. I think our cooks were going to quit and walk away that particular year. So that was a bit of a stressor. And we did find that staff did a little bit better in terms of having just being more alert first thing in the morning, because we know that teenagers do better starting about 10:30 rather than 8:30. But we found it very difficult the following week when campers showed up, and then we had to back the hours up. And so it was a bit of a struggle to do that. So we went back to the way of getting them used to what it would be like in the summer. But I have some other thoughts on that area that we'll discuss a little bit later on the show. But I have tried it, and we decided for us it just didn't work as well.
Cool. I tend to agree with that. I feel like one of my goals in staff training is to get the staff on that schedule. If you're going to wake up at 7:30, you're going to eat breakfast at 8, you're going to eat breakfast at 12:30, you're going to eat lunch at 12:30, dinner at 6:30, and that's how it's going to be. And so just go ahead and getting them into that routine, I think is more beneficial than necessarily resetting that schedule again after staff training. So. But that's a great question, and I think something certainly to consider. I also love to give my staff an occasional sleep-in date, and that's just, it's the best thing ever when you give them one of those.
That's right.
And it's free.
So true.
For us, same thing, we try both. I think, there is studies that show that young adults function better later on in the day. However, it's not just functioning better. It's also it's the warm-up period. So the thing is that if you're able to give your staff a warm-up period and what you expect of them early in that part of the day isn't as much as a little bit later, all they really need is about half an hour. So there are studies that if young adults could wake up later, they're higher functioning, but it's because that they wake up and they start right at that time. So if you give them a warm-up period before, so our staff meetings are before they wake up their campers. that makes a very, very big difference. When I'm talking to them, I let them know that they can have sleepy eyes. I don't mind as long as they're taking their notes. But when they get to their campers, they have a big smile and they're ready to go. So during staff training, we do the same thing. And during those meetings, we have a continental breakfast. There's snacks there, so there's nobody fainting. But it's also just to put into your framework, recognize in your schedule what you're expecting of them, and in the morning, let them warm up. Still do stuff that's important, but let them warm up. But I definitely think that you need to follow the schedule of the campers when they arrive, and make sure that the learning, happens in that schedule.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a great staff training theme week there that, you're athletes and you are training for this big task, the Olympics of summer camp. And so we got to warm up, we got to cool down, we have to provide those same times just like an athlete would. And it takes practice and all of those things. So there's definitely a way you could run with that. And whether you're expressly saying it or not, I think that could be a fun way to do it. I just want to add to the kind of the big picture discussion that I really try to set up my staff training so that we are doing general, very overview kind of stuff. We're talking about the mission. We're doing our community building. We're exploring the activities. We're doing all that stuff at the beginning. And, staff training is overwhelming. There's lots of new people. There's lots of new information. You're in a new place. And so I want to start big and help them understand why you're here. And this is an important job. And then after we've gotten that buy-in, then we can discuss the nitty-gritty of this is how you need to clean up pee sheets,
Yeah.
Because if you hit them with that the first day, it's going to be tough. And so I think that that's really important. And as we've said many times, that community building is such a key element. And I think having the staff play together in those first 24 to 48 hours is so critical to building the foundation of your staff for the rest of the summer. So that's really where I start. And it's, it may seem ridiculous to devote, significant amounts of time to just letting the staff play together, but I think it is a critical piece for the formation of that group.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're all on the same page with that for sure.
Yeah.
Another critical piece that we started to add in later that was such a good thing for us was that we invited the families or the parents to stay for lunch when they dropped their children off, who are not really children, but who are adults, obviously. And it was usually just the parents of new staff members who accepted. The other, older staff members obviously are driving themselves and leaving their cars at camp. But new parents would come. We would give them a tour as parents of staff members, not as parents of campers anymore. So it was different. So they got to see the staff lounge, the staff washrooms, the lockers, like all those kinds of things that they wouldn't necessarily have known about when they were parents of campers. We played games with them, which was awfully fun with their children as well. And then after lunch, we would have a meeting and we would go over what was expected of their child over the course of the summer. We would talk about when it was okay to contact their child, how we would hope they would help their children to be responsible and to do the best jobs possible. We would answer questions about when time off was and all those kinds of things, because we found that 17 and 18-year-olds often weren't terribly forthcoming with that kind of information to their parents. And so it was a really positive addition. It was something that just worked really well for us. And it really got our parents on board. Now, we talked with new parents on hiring days as well at the end of each hiring day, but this was just a really nice way for them to feel a part of things. And we would go over the things their child was responsible for in the summer. And they were always amazed. They couldn't believe that their child, whom they thought of, still as their little baby, was going to be able to be responsible for all of those things. So it was just a really positive addition.
I think that's such a great idea. I think that when you're trying to help staff members make the transition from being a camper to a staff member, and of course that CIT-LIT period is helpful.
Yep.
You still have parents that are extremely anxious or, and this is, some people would look at this as maybe doting on the parents. I think this is something that actually would ease their nerves as well.
Yes.
As, I mean, you have the experience from it, but I would assume that that's what would that's what would happen, and as well as just as a promotional piece.
Yes.
Such a fantastic idea. I think that's so nice.
And it cut down on issues through the summer with parents of staff members, and they just felt really welcome. And it was not a difficult thing. I mean, they would drop them off at 11. We'd play games with the parents and tour them and so on before lunch, and then have a meeting after lunch with just the parents while other staff members or directors were doing other things with the staff. And the parents were gone by 2:00. So it was not a big part of the day, but we found taking a director out and offering the parents that piece made a huge difference. So it's something I would recommend.
Very cool. Gab, did you have other thoughts on the big picture?
I think just it goes back to simplicity, but a lot of camps have, as we spoke about, staff members coming in staggered times depending on the position that they have at camp. And one of the things that I found to be very, very easy, or has helped us a lot, is to tell staff members that their training day starts at 9:00 on this date. So everybody starts at 9 a.m. and they have the choice to come in the evening before, but they can only come in after 4:00 in the afternoon, and they're responsible for themselves. And of course, we're very welcoming towards them, but usually there's training during that time, and we have to be focused on that training. So we always have a welcomer. We always have somebody that's going to, especially if there's a new staff, but of course, if they're returning staff as well, that welcomes them, makes sure that they get something to eat, go on a tour with the family, all this kind of stuff. But we start at 9. So everybody that comes in, we know that staff training is at 9:00, no matter what group you're part of, and that anybody can come in the day before. They can drive in that morning. It's up to them. But just keeping those things consistent, I think, is very, very helpful. And having a designated welcomer for those random people that are coming
Absolutely.
in. But people sometimes want to come in at 9:00 in the morning the day before, and then they're hanging around. They get more and more anxious. They get more and more nervous. So we want to limit that sort of free space for them.
Fantastic. Any other thoughts on the big picture before we move on to the next question?
I think that some of my former staff would be grateful that they worked for me then and not now, because the way that I look at it, I'd make a big change. So when I was at Tri-State, I went to a session on the culture of perfectionism in young women. And one of the things that they talked about was the need for sleep for that particular age group. And the fact that, sort of 17 to 20-year-olds need about 9.5 hours sleep a night. And the fact that because they are, so much is expected of them now, they are, trying to get perfect grades and be on all these activities and volunteer their time and do all this sort of thing. By the time they arrive at summer camp, they are 48 nights in the hole in terms of sleep. So they are getting so little sleep during the school year, they are 48 nights in the hole by the time they arrive at camp. And we just expect them to go the whole time. And we used to have a later curfew every night. I think it was 1 a.m. And the bell rang at 7:30. And one night a week in that 8-day period, we would have the ETB, or the early to bed, where the senior counselors would put their campers to bed. And I think I would change that up. If I were directing now, I think I would have everybody going to bed at a much earlier time, like 11, 11:30, no late nights. And one night during that week, I would let them stay up. So I would reverse it, I think, now, knowing what I know about the importance of sleep and the fact that 48 nights in the hole, then we get them to go constantly for 8 straight days, and then the kids show up. Are we getting enough out of them if we're not giving them enough rest? So I know some staff out there that would think, glad we already did that and we had our nights out, but I think I would change it up.
Cool. So let's move on to our next question, which is specifically talking about when you're scheduling your modules or your sessions or your different lessons. What are some tips and tricks for making those as effective as they can be and really making sure your message sticks? Let's start with you, Gab.
So I think this is your question. If it's not, then it's still good information. Okay, so basically, sequencing with all of your sessions is key, and that we sort of talked about that in the big picture. Knowing what your staff are anxious about, and knowing, they have these preoccupied questions that's going on in their heads, and a lot of it has to do with how they're going to make sure that their job is done well, and if they're going to make friends. And so these are, we want to sort of address these anxieties right at the beginning. And so any of the activities or sessions that we do sort of has to get them connected to the community, as well as show them exactly what they're going to be learning throughout this training, and that's worth their time. And that's very, very important that they get in their heads that everything that they're doing is worth their time. And one of the ways that we do that is by letting them know exactly what they're going to be able to do once they leave, once staff training is done. And we tell them that at the very beginning. We express expectations, of course. They express their expectations of us, but we create a group norm of how are we going to accomplish this as a team. And the other thing is we make sure that our sessions are done in a time-effective way. I've said this many times before, but I don't think speaking beyond 15 minutes is useful. And so we let them know that we're not wasting our time. We'll be speaking no more in blocks of time of 15 minutes in lectures. Then we'll be getting them to think and do some work, and then we'll continue with some of the information. But expectations clearly at the beginning, and addressing those anxieties, and starting them off basically on what's our focus for camp? Why are we here? What do we do? Everybody on the same page. Is that sort of what you're asking?
Yeah, right on top of it. Fantastic.
Nice. Great.
And I want to add to that. At one of my last jobs, we had in our staff manual, these are the objectives of staff training. And it wasn't that you're going to know everything. It was, you're going to be comfortable teaching 7 of the 24 classes, and you're going to be comfortable leading 3 of the hikes and 2 of the evening programs of the 7 or 8 that we offered. And so I think spelling that out for your staff, whether it's in writing in your staff manual, I read it to my staff last year and said, this is what we are expecting you to be able to do at the end of the training period, and understand that it's not that you're going to know everything. That's totally fine. I think the other expectation that's really important to spell out, because if you don't tell them, then they won't do it necessarily, is that you should be taking notes. This is, school, in that you're not going to remember everything, and we're going to be giving you a lot of information. So you should be taking notes. And I always tell my return staff that you need to model taking notes. Whether you're actually taking useful notes or not, you need to set that example, because if the new staff will see that, then that'll make them feel more comfortable, like, oh, they're doing it, I should do this too. And so even if you're just writing down a little tidbit here or there, have a notebook out, have a pen, and be ready, because that's something that the staff are going to need. And even if they don't ever look at those notes again, we know that just going through that process of writing it down does increase that learning. What about you, Beth?
Absolutely. So for us, I always try to remind myself that it's not about ideas, it's about making ideas happen. So you don't try to do so much that you don't get any of it done. And we always referred back to our why statement with every session or every small activity that we were leading. Is this part of why we are here? Does this help to reinforce that message? And we talked a little bit about this in our last podcast, but a lot of that conversation took place offline after we were done. Yes, we love camp that much that we kept talking about camp even when we weren't recording. But we were talking about some of the ideas from Dr. Tim Elmore, who was the closing keynote at Tri-State. And he was talking about making those messages Facebook messages as opposed to trying to be a TV. So Gab already touched on that she wouldn't be lecturing for more than 15 minutes. But I think times have changed now, and the sessions that I used to do, 20 years ago that could be an hour and a half long now need to be broken up, I think, into shorter bits so that they can remember them better. I also thought it was really important to physically change positions in the room. So not just where they are sitting or how they are sitting. And obviously for us, like every 15 minutes or so, they were standing up or moving around, or we threw in a quick back pocket game to sort of break the session up if it was a bit longer. But I would physically change positions if we were always in the lodge, move myself around so that my background in a course of an hour was 4 different things. We would do it outside if we could. We We would do it in the water if we could. We would do it on the roof of the lodge if we could. Really change it up and think those sessions through beforehand. How is your staff? Are they comfortable enough to be able to listen, or are they so comfortable that they're going to fall asleep? So you just sort of have to kind of think those things through. And we go back to this every single podcast, but we must front load. So always making sure that they have time to change clothes if they need to, or letting them know that they should come with their bathing suits under their clothes, or dressed for their climbing wall skill session with their closed-toed shoes, or have their hat and water, whatever it is they need. So letting them know that at perhaps a meal during the day, so that they come prepared to all of those sessions in the afternoon. And we used to say things like, make sure you have your notebook and pen, that Ruby was talking about, all that kind of stuff, I think is really important to letting them front load.
Cool. What about you, Gab? Any other tips and tricks you have?
I think this is an important, before, as you're planning your staff training, is an important part of that is reflecting on last year's staff training. Mm-hmm. And if you're not only, look at what worked and what didn't work, but also look at your staff and see how they've evolved as individuals. You'll have a lot of the same staff coming back, and see how they fit into the puzzle. And that's a very important thing. And as Ruby had said, you want to let your returning staff know that you still expect them to take notes. But how did these returning staff members fit into this year? How are we inspiring them? What are they going to gain out of this summer, out of this training, and how, without overwhelming our new staff? And I know that sounds a little bit complicated, but when you're sitting down and you're chit-chatting with your leadership team, it's very doable. But it's very, very important to also reflect on what was done last year, and mm-hmm. and measure the successes and maybe some of the oopses and what could we have done differently moments.
And definitely ask your staff that. I mean, we have a staff evaluation. We do evaluations throughout the summer kind of obsessively, and it's fantastic because it gives us lots of great information to use in the future. One of the things that I think is really important to build into your staff orientation is just some general activity exploration time. Mm-hmm. Some time for your staff to just go try some of the really cool stuff that you offer at camp. And if you give them that opportunity during orientation, it's less likely that they're going to be putting their needs first throughout the summer, because they've already tried it. They've had an opportunity to climb to the top of the Alpine Tower, or, to go mountain biking or whatever. And I think that that's so helpful. And I think it's also really critical that you explain to the staff, this is a time for you to go try something new. So if you were here last year and you taught fly fishing all summer, don't go to fly fishing. Go to some activity that you didn't see, because I want you to try a new skill. This is not committing you to teaching this activity. This is not saying that you're going to become an expert. And then they also get to see that activity run as it would be for kids, because they are a learner and a participant. And so then they get to hear some of that language and see how that should play out. And I know as a staff member, having now been at 3 different programs, that's really helpful to just have that time to go try stuff out. And then the biggest example I can think of, I don't love heights. I didn't love heights at all when I started working at camp. And I forced myself to climb our Alpine Tower because I was like, if I'm going to tell my kids that they should try it, I need to have tried it. And I mean, it was one of those, like, every step I went, I hated life a little bit more, but I made myself get up there, and I felt the sheer fear when the staff member at the bottom was like, all right, just slide off the platform, we'll lower you down. And I just remember thinking, they're crazy, but having that experience and having that, I made myself do it every year until I was on rope staff and then kind of got over that. But having that experience is so helpful for the staff when they are in that moment with that kid that's up there freaking out, and they can really legitimately say, I've been there, I know it's scary, here's some things that helped me. So give your staff that time to explore all that awesome stuff that you're offering, because it's going to make them love their job that much more.
Nice. I have a few more. I think that it's really important that staff get rest hour. They need to rest too, and I think you need to make it restful. So I'm not necessarily talking about those days back when I was a camper and you had to lie horizontal in your bunk and you weren't allowed to talk to anybody back in the 70s, but that it needs to be a time that is restful. A couple of other things, tricks that I used to pull out every year that I learned as I directed longer. I always had a basket of fidget toys. And I kept them at the front of a room, or I took them with me if I was in a different room teaching a session. And I allowed staff to come up, grab a fidget toy. And I just went to the dollar store and bought like silly putty and, balls and all those kinds of things. And they could play with them during the session as long as they were not playing with each other with them or, throwing the balls around the room, that sort of thing. But I had a staff member one year who taught me that she was such a fidgeter and she was always playing with something. And I, used to talk to her after a session and say, were you actually paying attention? And she really was, but she needed to be fidgeting with something. So they just knew that they could come in, grab a fidget toy, sit down, play with it, and then put it back at the end of the session. I always had peppermints for the first session after lunch. It was a good way for them for digestion, but also sort of woke them up a bit. Always have something visual in every session because it really helps them to remember things. It helped me to remember things for sure. And one of the things that I think is really key is whether you use true colors or whatever sort of personality things that you use at your camp, you want to be able to be sure that every session has something for all four of those colors. So, for those gold staff members, you want to make sure that you've given them a schedule so they know what's coming up, and you're going to really do your best not to make changes at the last minute. And you're going to, give them time to get to know each other and be creative. If they're your blue staff, you're going to make it really fun and energetic and schedule games and breaks or songs for your orange staff. You're going to make it really interesting and allow them to discover new things or try new things on their own. Or give them extra material to read if they choose to, or the science behind it, or whatever for your green staff. But you really want to try to change things up within each session so that everybody's getting something that really sort of appeals to them.
Cool. Gab, any other thoughts on tips and tricks?
Yeah, I'll add two more. I think with whatever staff group you have, it's important to recognize what are some of the things you want to shift and what are some of the things you want to keep. And as Beth had mentioned before, there is a culture of young women that are becoming quite perfectionist, and they're very stressed, and they tend to be, and they just sort of burn themselves out. And I was talking with a camp director, and he had sort of he has male staff, and he said that every camp should, in their interviews, ask, what have you done for somebody lately? And he says this really helps with, really helps with me finding those right staff. And I was like, I do not want to ask that to my staff, because I don't want to perpetuate this notion that I want them to do stuff for other people. I know they do it, and it's without focusing on themselves. So I think there's certain cultural norms that we have in our camps, and it's important to recognize them, and it's important to sort of address them. So in my camp, play or spontaneous play is a little bit difficult. Women have a hard time to just like pick up a ball and just start playing. So creating those pockets where there's spontaneous play, and if you can't see what I'm doing like the little bunny ears. I have staff members that are there to encourage, like, oh, come, we're going to go play soccer, we're going to do this. So it gets them used to just getting up and playing during those sort of break times. And that's something that's really important that I want my staff to do. The other thing is something that I learned from Jackie, who's the director of our camp. And no matter what, you want everybody from the highest person at your camp to be doing the manual labor. So putting in the docks, bringing down the canoes, obviously if you're physically capable, but doing the grunt work. And it's very important for leadership team members to get this at the very beginning, because they do have a lot of work to do, and they tend to start to prioritize, like, oh, I just won't go put on I won't take the canoes down. Is that okay, guys? I'm just going to work on this paperwork. Actually, no, this is one of the most important things for all staff members to do together. It's team building, but it also says we're in it together, and we're helping each other out. So I think that's something that should be incorporated. And if everything's set up at your camp already, make sure you have some labor available for your staff so that they feel like they're contributing to the camp, and it makes it theirs.
Ownership is key.
Yeah, so key. Agreed. Fantastic. The last couple that I would add, just going off what Beth said, using something visual. I love movie clips and YouTube clips and videos. I put those into training a lot. I think that they are, again, really helpful in getting the mind thinking, but also reaching out to our audience and getting them to say, oh, okay, this is something I should pay attention to because this clip just happened and I don't totally know why it connects, but we're going to talk about it. So I think that that's really key, using that mixed media, using visuals. I also think unstructured time, you have to be very careful with it during staff orientation because you want the staff to feel that their time is valued. But I think it's also really helpful to have some built-in unstructured time. We have a free time as part of our camp program, and it's before dinner. And so as much as possible, I try to include that into our orientation schedule as well. And so the free time activities will be open, but one of the nice things about free time is if you just want to sit in the field and write in your journal or talk to a friend or start a jam session or whatever it might be, you have that opportunity to do it. I have been through staff trainings that were so programmed that you got to the end of the day and you shut down because you couldn't absorb anything else. And so just having some of that downtime, whether that's in the form of a rest hour after lunch or a free time before dinner, having that, also utilizing your transitions really well, because that can be a nice, time to breathe and relax, but also be useful time. I know something that Tom Heck does, which he did with our staff one year, was he said, okay, we're going to go out to the field, and in that time, I want you to discuss 3 things that you've taken from this session. And so it was a nice time to process and review. But we also, again, it was that kind of like that sigh of relief. You're not so heavily programmed, so heavily structured, learning every single moment of every single day. So I think that's really key to build in.
Can I just add, Ruby, too, that I think along those lines, I think you need to be ready also when the time comes, and don't do it very often, but to throw all of it out the window. So one particular day, we were leading a session, and it had been such a hot week. And in Ontario in June, you never know what you're going to get. It could be like freezing and everyone's wearing toques, or it could be so hot that it's really hard for them to stay focused. And all of a sudden we had this huge downpour in the middle of a session, and you could just see the staff had been so drained by the humidity of the week. And I just knew this was the moment. And so I said, and now for the next part of this session, we're all going to go outside. And they just looked at me like I was crazy, and we puddle jumped for like half an hour and just played in the rain. And I still have staff, I think that was like 10 years ago, and they still talk about the magic of that moment where we just said, because one of our key phrases for us was always people before program. And so I just knew that we just needed to stop whatever session we were doing and go outside and play in the rain. Now, I also had these particular bottles that I was going to do something with later in the week. So while it was raining, we collected little jars of raindrops near the end after we had done all this puddle jumping. And it was amazing camp photos that came out of that experience. But at the end of the week, I gave them back all their bottles of rain as a memory of that week, and to remember all the magical moments that you can capture and hold with you. So sometimes you just have to be ready to toss it aside and just do something special.
Very cool. Very cool. So let's move on to our last question, and that is, how do you talk about the hard stuff? I think that's something that people a lot of times struggle with. How do you approach some of those topics that aren't as fun to talk about but need to be covered? Beth, do you want to start us off?
As we discussed in one of our last podcasts about returning staff facilitating training, you have to be really careful whom you choose to lead these particular hard sessions. You have to be sure that they are mature enough to handle them really well. So I think that's a key point. We were always sure never to put them all together or even on the same day, and always follow them up with something warm or something fun or something warm and fuzzy. So we were a co-ed camp, and I often found that people just felt kind of uncomfortable and icky after the sexual harassment session. And so to do something that brought us together as a group afterwards was really was key, I think. Being really sensitive when you have hard sessions. So if you're talking about bullying or a child abuse or something like that, have leadership team members who are really prepared to watch the rest of the staff during those difficult topics. Some staff may have experienced some of those things themselves in their childhood or currently, and they may get upset. So you need to have really sensitive leadership training members who will notice those things, who can go over and sit beside them or quietly walk out with them out of the room, that kind of thing. I think that's key to have that sort of foundation in place. And we would always explain to them ahead of time that these topics were really difficult and that it was okay to feel uncomfortable, and to front load by telling them that you know that they will be really sensitive and mature as we handle the difficult conversations. For us, we knew that it doesn't ever get easier to do the hard topics. You just get better at it. So I think those are some of the things we thought about when we were doing the hard stuff.
Cool, great. What about you, Gab?
I think the hard topics are difficult simply because we might be a little bit uncomfortable with them to begin with. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes what happens is we brush over them in our minds. We're like, oh yeah, I'm going to do sexual harassment. And then you're kind of like, ah. But then if you're really passionate about, let's just say, camp announcements, you're going to be getting costumes, and you have there's a whole setup, and who knows, there's stuff happening. There's a soundtrack. And then the uncomfortable stuff, we're uncomfortable, and therefore we sort of sometimes brush over it. So I think recognize where you're at with some of these. I feel that's the same with stuff that you might find is mundane. Things that you're not energized about or that make you uncomfortable tend to be difficult sessions because the person that's leading it is having a hard time on how to convey that information. So just be aware of where you're at with those sessions, or whoever's leading it, and at the very end, you're always looking at making sure staff members are absorbing this information. So what information, you're going back to your basics. How are the staff absorbing it, and why do they need to know this? And that's going to be sort of your guiding light. And if you need to use small group discussions, or if you need to use visuals, I think that whatever is going to get the information across will help you, but just be aware where you're at with the information emotionally.
Great. And to tag team off of that, something that we've done in the past is bring in guest speakers. So having folks from our insurance company or mental health professional or from social services, somebody who is more comfortable talking about these topics, can be a great resource. It can also be really rough. So make sure you've really clearly laid out expectations with them about what we need to cover, and are you comfortable talking in front of other people? Because I've seen that happen as well. Like, oh yeah, we'll bring somebody out from this organization. They deal with us all the time, but they are not comfortable at all talking in front of people. And then you have a staff that's sitting there used to listening to really engaging, exciting leaders who are passionate about what they're talking about. And then we have this, and it just makes the whole thing worse. But I think some of the best risk management discussions that I've seen and sessions I've sat in on were people from our insurance company who came and just, that was their job. Their job was to go talk to camp people and talk about how to manage your risk. And so utilizing those resources. I also really love using scenarios and small group discussions with those challenging moments or challenging situations, because I think as a staff member, one of my biggest fears is that I'm going to have this situation happen and I'm just not going to know what to do in that very moment. This child has disclosed something to me or something has happened, and I'm just not going to know what to say. And so a couple ways you can do that. We, at Nature's Classroom, we used to do What's Your Next Move? And so after we did a staff manual review, this was part of our routine. And we would divide up into small groups, return staff with new staff, and we'd be given a scenario. And then the small group would talk about, this is the scenario, this is what I would do. And then we would share with the whole group, and then we'd add on to that. The director would be able to give some feedback. But it was fantastic because it let you open your eyes to some of those challenging things that could happen, but also really have that moment of, okay, it's that moment right now. What do I do? And I think having staff practice some of those phrases, really literally having them say them to each other, is so key, because when that situation happens, it's going to come out a lot easier than if they haven't ever said the words. I think it's very empowering for them to feel like they have the tool to react to those situations. And one of the tactics that I like to use is to just set up a little scenario, whether it's in front of the whole group or a small group, and have one person that's been told, like, all right, you're going to say something, and you are the counselor role playing as the person who's reacting, and the person who's reacting has no idea what's going to happen. And so that person who has the quote or whatever setting up the scenario, they say whatever it is, and we watch that counselor react, that staff member say or do whatever they would do, and then we can debrief and talk about that. And again, it's a great way for your, especially return staff at the beginning, and then new staff to take another leadership role as well. So I think that's a fun way. That's not just, let me tell you what we're going to do in this emergency. We get to kind of see it happen. We get to practice. Any other thoughts on the hard stuff?
I think you want to be sure that you've set everything up to set the mood. So I always used to talk about that with staff who were leading sessions. I wanted them to think about every session like a theatrical experience. And so were they using music, or were they using costume, or, how was the audience participation, those kinds of things. So when you're dealing with the hard stuff, I always wanted to think about how the staff were seated. So if we were talking about something really difficult, like child abuse or those kinds of things, putting them into a nice circle where they're not sort of facing me and I'm, lecturing at them, but we were in a circle, we were in a cohesive group. I didn't want certain topics to be done with them sitting at tables where they're separated from each other. You wanted to think about what mood you were trying to create and go for. So I always would think about their physical comfort. Is it too hot? Are they too tired? Is it a session right after lunch? Then don't put it there. All of those kinds of things. But to me, we're also changing it up all the time so that they weren't always sitting in sort of lecture format, but putting them into positions where it's going to make the topic easier and more comfortable for them.
Great. Gab, did you have any other thoughts on that one?
No, but all of my staff are going to be saying this summer, what's my next move? They're going to be like, oh, you went to a conference and this went. I'm like, no, I learned it on a podcast. So they know. They're like, oh, this is her new thing. Yes, it is. Guess what we're going to be saying this summer? I'm already translating it. It's in French.
Oh, good.
Good. The last thought I would throw out on that is, again, to consider that timing. I tend to like to put some of that heavier stuff early in the day, whether it's the first thing or, sandwiched between a couple other topics. I think that can be helpful, because then you're not sending the staff to bed like mulling over this really hard thing. By the time they go to bed, it was ages ago that you covered this thing, and it's not going to weigh on them so heavily. Every time we did the risk management talk in any staff training I've ever been in, I always have that moment of like, why do I do this? Because it's an intimidating discussion when you're talking about emergency procedures and all the things that could go wrong, and that can really weigh on people. So do consider that, and yeah, so that's what I would add to that. So I think it's about that time. Gab, tell us what we learned today.
Well, I know I learned so much. So let's start with the big picture. Simplify, run your training like summer camp. Have your leadership team / senior staff maybe be the role model counselors. The counselors can be campers. Be ready, be ready, be ready. I think we say that in every single podcast. Sequencing your sessions, you have to respect that. Ask your parents to stay for lunch and even participate in perhaps a fun camp activity. Staff training, let's keep consistent times. Scheduling and modules, spell things out, let them know what is expected of them, ask them what they expect from you. Make sure that we're respecting all personality types. Always ask why, bring it back. Also physically change the learning positions, use media, unstructured time, flexible schedule, people before program. Peppermints are very good for concentration. Who knew? Rest hours also important for staff. Fidget toys, I'm going to be using that in the summer. And always use visuals. For the hard stuff, let's be sensitive and express that this is tough stuff, but we need to go through it. Set it up so that everyone is comfortable. Know where you're at. Check with your emotions. Bring in experts, but make sure they're good ones. What mood are you trying to create? And again, respect the schedule. And that's what we learned today.
Awesome. And we want you all to get involved, so you can join us on the hashtag CampCode and tell us what topics you would like to discuss, any guests that you'd recommend we talk to, and any great leadership training tips that you might have to share. We'd love to hear them, because this industry is all about sharing, and that's one of the things that makes it so fantastic to be a part of. So we want you to know how to get in touch with us. So let's start with you, Beth. How can people find you if they want to get in touch with you?
They can find our website at camphacker.tv. They can email me directly at beth@camphacker.tv, or you can find us on Twitter on the hashtag camphacker.
Cool. How about you, Gab?
You can check out where I work at waro.com. You can email me at gabz, G-A-B-Z, at waro.com. And you can also follow me on Twitter, Gabrielle Rail.
Cool. And you can find me at greenriverpreserve.org. I'm also on Twitter at rubylyn85. Or you can email me, ruby@greenriverpreserve.org. So Beth, why don't you tell us what's coming up with our next podcast?
Our next podcast is a great topic. We're going to be talking about that was last year, this is this year. So we'll be talking about recovering from a bad year, or how to do things right if this is your first year.
Cool. And our final segment on each podcast is a best practice for leadership trainings. And we would love to hear some of your most memorable moments or most effective tips. We actually have a show coming up where we're going to be sharing all best practices and those most memorable staff training moments that you've experienced. And we would love to hear some of yours. You can tell us again what those are at hashtag CampCode. This week's best practice is all about names. It is vitally important to learn the names of your staff, just like it's important for our staff to learn their campers' names. And so whether you need to create a cheat sheet ahead of time, if you're collecting bios for your website and studying up, whatever it takes, as an employee, if the director or the big boss knows your name, it sure makes that employee feel a little more appreciated and a little more like a real person and a little more like somebody is watching out for them in this new environment. Likewise, I remember as a staff member desperately wanting to know everybody else's name. I craved that time when you stood in a giant circle for an hour and each person shared his or her name and how many years they've been at camp and what their favorite adjective was that started with the same first letter as their name. I mean, all of those things. I wanted that so bad. And I know now that there are lots of other ways to introduce staff in more engaging and personable ways. However, you have to keep in mind that your staff want to get to know each other, and they may come in with that expectation that that time is going to happen, but they also may not always have the tools to meet each other and introduce themselves. They just may not know how to do that. So something that I did when I worked at YMCA Camp Widgiewagon in Nashville, we had a staff of approximately 150. And by our opening campfire, which to be fair was usually the second night of training, my goal was always to get up in front of the whole staff, and I would go through and call out everyone by name. So they would stand up in the rows they were sitting, and I would just, plink, 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 plink right through. The other thing that makes this a little bit difficult is that everybody had camp names. So there was no studying ahead of time. I had to learn them in the time that they had gotten there. But the point was that if in 24 hours I can learn 150 names, you in 15 minutes can learn the names of your 12 kids in your tribe or your cabin. And I spent a lot of time in that first 24 hours of staff training just walking up to any staff at every free moment possible and saying, "Hi, what's your name? Nice to meet you, Twigs. I'm Ruby. Twigs, tell me a little bit about how you found out about camp." And a key to remembering names is repetition. I remember hearing somewhere, sometime, that it takes about 7 times of repetition of hearing somebody's name, saying somebody's name to make it stick. The other really big key is to actively listen when somebody tells you their name, because all too often, we've all done it, you ask somebody's name and then you're spending the time that they're telling you your name contemplating what you're going to say next. So actively listen, repeat in your head 7 times, and show off your mad name remembering skills. Thanks for listening, and please join us on the hashtag Camp Code.